Welcome to the SACNAS Native Initiatives webinar series. Our webinar today is Indigenous Math, Teaching, Sharing, and Building Community. My name is Daryl Monto, and I am the SACNAS Native Initiatives Manager. I am an enrolled member of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma and also of Apache and Comanche descent. The SACNAS Native Initiatives Program is excited to provide this programming for our Native American and Indigenous membership, and we will continue to work on bringing more webinars on issues that matter and opportunities to our community. I want to welcome our first-time SACNAS attendees. We are an inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM, where the field reflects the demographics of our country's population. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization, SACNAS creates space where all members, partners, and staff feel they belong and can embrace and celebrate their intersectional identities. We invite you to join the SACNAS community at membership.sacnas.org. At the end of this presentation, we will have time for a Q&A session. You can also use the chat feature to say hello to fellow SACNistas. Here are some basic housekeeping rules we ask our audience to follow. Please submit typed questions via the Q&A feature. Be polite, mindful, and respectful in the chat. And when asking a question, feel free to share your institution or your location. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. Joining us are three dynamic SACNistas who collaborated to bring you this awesome webinar. Dr. Marissa Loving is an NSF postdoctoral fellow and visiting assistant professor in the School of Mathematics at Georgia Tech. Dr. Belen Sinogini is an associate professor of mathematics at Santa Fe Community College. And Dr. Kamilla Young, Associate Professor of Mathematics at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. And I will now turn it over to them so that they can share more about themselves, and we will begin the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dale, and thank you for having us. So I'm Marissa Levy. I am an NSF postdoc at Georgia Tech, and I finished, I guess, just over a year ago, my PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in mathematics. And before that, I spent my time on the Big Island of Hawaii. So that's where I grew up. And I also went to undergrad there. So I went to undergrad at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, which was a phenomenal experience. I had a really fantastic cohort, both of faculty and of fellow students, who we sort of went through all of our math classes together, and it was just such a warm and welcoming space to be in. I always felt like I belonged. I really always felt like I belonged. I went to my first SACNAS conference actually as an undergrad in 2010, so it's just about a decade ago now, which was really, really exciting. But yeah, so I guess this panel is sort of focusing on the topic of Indigenous folks in mathematics, and also sort of on our work on community building. And community building is something that is really important to me. I think particularly because of my experience in graduate school. I went from being an undergrad, being sort of with a cohort of fellow students. There was other Hawaiian students in my cohort in undergrad in mathematics. And of course, there was lots of students of color just in general, to being one of the few women of color in my graduate program. And I think at the beginning of that, I just sort of internalized a lot of sort of the aloneness I was feeling and the isolation I was feeling, and as being sort of indicative of myself not belonging in sort of mathematical spaces, that maybe it was some inherent lack in me that was really making me feel so much discomfort in these places. But sort of the journey of graduate school, I got to meet some really phenomenal women of color who I connected with and started to really focus on building community with in my department and without my department. So I was really lucky to meet Wella a little bit before I started grad school and start connecting with some other awesome folks. But yeah, I think the experience of being just a woman of color in general, and then specifically an Indigenous woman in math, you sort of, if you don't start building community, you're gonna really struggle to sort of stay, because there aren't sort of naturally places for us to be. So that's just a very little bit of me. Hopefully we'll be talking more about this as we go.
All right, thanks, Marissa. Belen, do you want to go next? Yes, I can go next. Hehet, Daryl, Hehet, uh, everyone for being here. Yat Asia A Belen Sinogini and Asia Filipino Nishle. Tachini Bashi Filipino Dashache, Senajini Dashanale. Santa Fe, New Mexico, de Kashte, not Nojin de Nisha. Akut Ego de Nishle. And it's really great to see all of you, and it's really great to continue to be carving out spaces where I can identify myself in our traditional Navajo introductions, and to find collaborators where I feel more and more comfortable in doing that with. Um, so thank you everyone for being here, and I'll share a little Sackness story where as an undergrad, at the last minute, I went to a Sackness conference being held in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And one of the keynote speakers was Dr. Bill Velez, and he's a mathematician, and then he was a professor at University of Arizona, and that's one of the schools I was considering. And it was, I didn't know it would be so awesome to see a person of color and a brown person speaking about mathematics. And this person was at a university that I wanted to attend for graduate school. So after his speech, I ran it to him, caught up with him, and we connected. And he was kind of my point person in the application process. And since then, we've maintained contact over the years. But my name is Belen Sinogini. I am a faculty at Santa Fe Community College. I also spent 8 years at the Institute of American Indian Arts at Tribal College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I introduced myself as Navajo, and also noting that my mother is Filipina, who grew up in Hawaii, and my sisters and I, we grew up in Notnilji, New Mexico, on the Navajo reservation. I chose my higher education institutions because they're close to home, at University of New Mexico, and got my graduate degree from University of Arizona. And throughout the process, I knew that I was good at math. I knew that I liked mathematics, and I wanted to keep doing mathematics. And the further along that I went, I liked mathematics, but I didn't understand how I would be able to connect that with my community. And I knew that I wanted to return home. So that my Zoom background is actually our home, where my sisters and I grew up in Torreon, New Mexico. So I didn't like the idea that if I had pursued a research one track in mathematics, that I would not have control or less control over where I would end up. So I wanted to switch tracks to math education, where I felt I would have more control over being able to come back home in New Mexico and be near with family and friends that I grew up with. So that was also influenced by the fact that my parents are both educators, my grandparents are educators, and many people in our family, in our surroundings, and we grew up around educators. And so through education and mathematics education, I felt that I'd be able to have an influence to give back to my communities and have an influence on my communities. And that vied well with being at a tribal college and a community college, where more of those missions are community oriented, and also had the capacity to be back home. So there are lots of ins and outs of that, and I'm hoping to share more about that throughout this session. So yeah, everyone, thank you.
All right, thanks. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Kamilla Young. I'm an associate professor at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. I'm originally from Hawaii. I'm native Hawaiian. When I was in high school, I really loved math. I was on the math team. I was one of those geeks in high school, but I didn't know what to do in math, or what I could do with math, and so I started college in Los Angeles, majoring in civil engineering. I really loved it, but I took so many math courses that I realized if I take a couple more, I can get a minor in math, and of course I love math, so why not? So I took more math courses, and I thought it might help me as an engineer. But I just kept taking more and more math courses, and before I realized it, if I just had like 3 more courses, I got a second degree. So I started to do that. People asked me, "What are you going to do with a math degree?" I had no idea. I said, teach maybe. I really didn't know what you could do with math. So I kept taking courses, and ultimately I ended up taking a math modeling course for my senior capstone project. And that course really changed my perspective. Like I didn't realize that you could use like math models to model everything around you. Yeah, so that really inspired me to want to go ahead and pursue math more as a career. And so then I went to the University of Iowa for my graduate school. So I went from Loyola Marymount University in LA, a small liberal arts school, to University of Iowa, where I got my master's and PhD in mathematics, in applied math. And throughout my journey in Iowa, I really didn't see any other Hawaiians or even Pacific Islanders. And it wasn't until 2010 I went to my first, about 2010 or 20, maybe 2009. But anyway, it's been over 10 years. I went to my first SACNAS conference, and on the very last day, and the last, they had like a Sunday breakfast at that time, and someone said, "Hey, do you know this person?" And they introduced me to Rebecca Garcia, and she was the first Pacific Islander she's Chamorro, and it really inspired me just to see a familiar face, and because before that I thought I was the only one, and in fact, when I got my PhD in 2012, I was the first Native Hawaiian ever to get a PhD in applied mathematics. That number has since changed. There have been several more people. So numbers are changing, but after I got my PhD, I started meeting more people. I met Marissa. I met some other folks, Kyle Dahlin, and so the tides are turning, and we started meeting different people, and it just got it started to feel like there are more and more of us. And last SACNAS in Hawaii, we finally had enough people that we had our first session on Pacific Islanders in mathematics, and we highlighted all these people, and it was so fun, and we didn't know where to go from there, and so we had a meeting afterwards, and we've kind of kept going, and so now this webinar is one of the results of that meeting. And so the first thing we're going to talk about today is more of like Indigenous mathematics. Right now, the panel here are all Indigenous people who identify as mathematicians, but one of the things is Indigenous math or ethnomathematics, and that's something that we all that we as the panel have heard of, but we're actually not necessarily experts in, and it comes down to maybe what is Indigenous math or what is ethnomathematics, because everyone has a different definition, but it's in essence, it's tying in culture with mathematics, and so, some of it is relating ancestral knowledge to what we do, and there's some really great places out there that are doing things like that. I know there's a lot of Indigenous math circles that are going around for that have programs that tie in those things. The University of Hawaii College of Education has an Ethnomath graduate certificate where people can learn about that as well. So there are some programs and things for people to learn. But even me personally, as a Native Hawaiian mathematician, I didn't know how I could tie in ethnomath into what I was doing. In fact, I've gone to places and people asked me, because I'm a Native Hawaiian mathematician, they asked me about ethnomath, and I really didn't know. And for a while, I felt like I was a bad Hawaiian for not being able to answer that question. That like, gosh, maybe I should know. And so what I first want to say is that it's okay if you don't know, because we're Indigenous people and we identify as math. Math is a very large field. There's so many things that we can specialize in, and we all have our specialties. And so it's all right to not have that feeling necessarily. But some of what Indigenous math is it's how we create math. How do we tie in just what we have with what we're doing right now? And maybe Marissa, you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, so I've spent some time thinking about this as well, because I definitely have had sort of that same scenario that Wella described, where I'll mention that I'm Native Hawaiian and I'm a mathematician, and folks will sort of ask me what I know about sort of what like ancestral our ancestors knew about math, and what did they do, and is that what I do? And so one of the things that I've spent some time thinking about is just sort of the way that we think about Indigenous peoples in science and STEM spaces. This is something that I think I've spent more time thinking about recently because of the things that have gone on at home on Mauna Kea surrounding the TMT. And I think it was my first time really thinking of what it meant for me to be an Indigenous person in math, rather than being sort of just a brown woman in math or Hawaiian in math, but really thinking like what it means to have a connection to the land and be like a scientist, right? Sort of have this, there's a certain authority, especially with mathematics, because people always think of it as the thing that is sort of means you're very smart and you're like very cerebral and very something like this. And so there's some sort of authority that's given to you in that space, but there's the tension that also comes with this sort of perception of what people think it means to sort of uphold Indigenous knowledge, that it's somehow just this sort of ancient thing where you're just like tied to your past and you can't move into the future. And so really thinking about that and thinking about what it meant for me to be a mathematician and to be Hawaiian, and the way that made me feel very responsible to speak out about how I felt about what was happening with the TMT, and to sort of make clear that like, I'm not like either a mathematician or Hawaiian. I am both of these things. And that means that like, I can appreciate the sort of science that they want to have happen on Mauna Kea while still asserting the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination. And that means for us to be able to determine what happens to our lands and our waters and our homes, right? And so I think this also has sort of made me think harder too about what it means to have Indigenous math. What does it mean to do Indigenous math? And I like to think that the math that I do as a Hawaiian, as an Indigenous person, is Indigenous math, right? I create new math through my research. And although it may not be like ethnomathematics, so I'm a geometric group theorist. So my work is mostly in sort of low dimensional topology and studying the mapping class group. But I create new math when I do my research, and I bring my own perspective, and I bring my own histories, and I bring my own approaches to that work. And so that math that I create, that is Indigenous math because I'm an Indigenous person and it's mine. And so I do think that it's sort of important to remember that like Indigenous peoples aren't static, right? And neither is sort of the math or the science that we create. And so I want to sort of turn this over to Belen, because one thing that he mentioned when I was sort of discussing this with him ahead of time was also the way in which we think about what it really means to be Indigenous. What does Indigenous mathematics mean, and how does that sort of relate not only to the work we're doing, sort of the actual types of math we're creating, but also to the sort of the ways that we're creating the mathematical spaces that we're in. So maybe Belen.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to share my experiences with Willa and Marissa, where I often get asked, being a mathematician who is Navajo, and this comes a lot of times from community members who are asking me, oh, let's think about ethnomathematics, or let's connect mathematical knowledge with Navajo culture and language. And that's challenging because I didn't grow up feeling proficient in Navajo culture and language, even though I grew up here. And that kind of ties into the conversation we're having, where to talk about what is Indigenous mathematics, has to deal with understanding what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to be a mathematician. And when we unpack that more, we realize that being Indigenous and being Native Hawaiian or of a citizen of a tribal nation is inherently political. And so is being a mathematician, where the people and scholars in ethnomathematics talk about not only the cultural aspect of mathematics, but also the political aspect of mathematics. And so when we talk about ancestral mathematics and how there's a want and a need to tie ourselves to how our ancestors explored and understood mathematics, we also have to understand why there's a disruption and why we in 2020 feel disconnected from that. And we can't understand that without understanding the colonization, the projects of colonization, and the socio-political projects of land theft and assimilation. So what I've been trying to do more with my work is when I have these backgrounds here and having that tied into and talking about how our indigeneity is often tied with place and literal place in our ancestral lands. When some examples I bring up is the Chacoan astronomy. So near here are the ancient dwellings of the ancestors of the Puebloan people. And I meant to do this, but here in Santa Fe, I'm on the traditional homelands of the Tewa and Carib-speaking Pueblo peoples. And this background here is our ancient Chacoan dwellings, and there is evidence of the ancient mathematics that they engaged in and used mathematics as embedded in their astronomy and in their skies to track what's going on in the skies as embedded in their astronomy. But we don't learn about that, and we feel disconnected with that, and maybe be disconnected with the ways that our ancestors have practiced mathematics because of the colonizing projects here. But that doesn't mean that it's lost or that we can't do anything about it, because those projects are still ongoing, whether it's with that 30-meter telescope or how mathematics is tied to the sciences nowadays. And as mathematicians, we're starting to realize our responsibilities in understanding how the relationship between mathematics research, and those science projects have to do with those ongoing projects that perpetuate land theft and colonialism. So I think, we're still navigating the ways where we get asked about the importance of ancestral knowledge, but we also have to make sure that it doesn't stay ancient, that we realize that we're the living embodiments of the ancestral knowledge, and that that's our responsibility moving forward, is to help people in understanding that and helping ourselves to realize that within our own context.
Yeah, so those are all wonderful things, and I want to add that so I hadn't known about that what I was doing was ethnomath, but this past summer I really started learning, and it was through a workshop that I had organized, how I could incorporate like Native Hawaiian ways into what I'm doing, and to that end, I revamped the pre-calculus course I'm teaching, and I'm teaching it through the perspective of Polynesian navigation. So there's a lot of stuff out there with Polynesian navigation, and I'm looking at the attendee list, and I see there's a lot of people that are are I've gone through Dr. Linda Ferruto, who's a dear colleague of mine. She has the Ethnomath certificate, and so many of you might even know more about it than I do. But I'm learning about ethnomath and Polynesian navigation, how I can incorporate that in math. For example, one of the things that I'm doing is as you're sailing, the earth is not flat, right? It's curved. And so as you get into an island, how do you determine how close you are, or when you'll first see the island peak over the horizon? And that relates to inverse trig. There's a problem you do, and you can see how tall is the island or the mountain, and then you base it off of the curvature of the earth, so the radius of where you're at, and you can determine how close you are before you actually start to see it. So yeah, for example, if you're sailing to Rapa Nui, or Easter Island as some people call it, it's very isolated. It's just one island, and if you miss it, if you're 50 miles away and you just miss it, you're going to sail right by it and not see it and not hit any other land. But if you're going to where Marissa's from, the Big Island, and Mauna Kea is really tall. Mauna Kea is the tallest mountain if measured from the base to the height, but most of it's underwater. But Mauna Kea, you can see Mauna Kea when you're about 120 miles away from the land. So you have a much better shot of seeing it, even if you're slightly off course. And if you're off course a little bit more to the north, you're going to hit the other Hawaiian islands. So there, it's okay. But Rapa Nui is much more I guess risky. You have that one shot and that's it. But there's a lot of math that's tied into it, and I'm learning and I'm reading all about it, and I'm just really excited to do that, and just kind of, now that I've reset my thinking and I'm learning more just about Polynesian navigation, then I can make these connections, how I can tie these other things that I hadn't realized. It was right in front of me, but I hadn't reset the way that I was thinking of Ike Hawaii, Nohona Hawaii, and incorporating all those ways of learning into these materials. And so it took a good dedication for me to just sit down and kind of look and think, and for me to learn about Polynesian navigation. It's not something that I was aware of, or that I had any knowledge of. And so it did take that time for me to understand that, and then sit down and figure out how I can make those connections. But those connections are there. I mean, those are all things that our ancestors did. They may not have called it trigonometry, but they had these knowledges. Just even sailing is vectors. If you understand vectors, you go from one direction, then you go to another. So there is things out there, and really I do think there's a lot of Indigenous math circles. I know there were Navajo math circles, I believe. At one of the SACNAS plenary talks in I want to say like 2017, Henry Fowler was the director of the Navajo math circles, and so I believe you can find one of his talks on YouTube if you Google like Henry Fowler and SACNAS. But I mean, there's other things out there. There's I know Belen is the board of the Indigenous Math Circles.
The Alliance of Indigenous Math Circles.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so there are resources out there. They might not be as plentiful as other things, but there are some things out there, and I do. If you are interested, I encourage you to search those things. The Alliance of Indigenous Math Circles, the Certificate of Ethnomathematics at University of Hawaii. Those are great places to start. They have websites that do have lots of information out there. But, yeah, does anyone else want to add about Indigenous math or ethnomath?
I can expand on the Math Circles project since you mentioned it. So I got asked to be on the advisory board for the Alliance of Indigenous Math Circles. And that is stemming out of the project started by Tatiana Shubin and also led in collaboration with Henry Fowler, where they're introducing math circles in Native communities in an effort to expose them to mathematics that is not typically seen in K-12 curricula, and providing students from Native communities opportunities to explore and grapple with mathematics without the pressures of grading and things like that. And there's a documentary called Navajo Math Circles where people can learn more about it. And being on the advisory board, I'm honored to have been asked to be on the advisory board, but that question still kind of continues, where we're grappling with what makes these math circles Indigenous. And it's a really interesting thing to think about, because one potential I see with the math circles, given that they're taking place within Native communities, is that there's a potential to further explore the connections between mathematics and place, and to further grapple with, and if we're going to take asset-based approaches and see our communities as doers of mathematics, that this is an opportunity to see our families, our parents, and people from our community, and the ways that not only did our ancestors practice mathematics, but the way that our people nowadays practice and do mathematics, and see what we do nowadays as mathematical and draw upon that knowledge. So I'm excited to see the directions that these we take with the math circles. And I always get excited when Dr. Rochelle Gutierrez gets on here, because she's on here. And I think about her too when she talks about her work with, when I think about her work with Rehumanizing Mathematics, that we've had ancestors and people who have done and really humanized ways of mathematics that's different from how many of us have experienced it in the classrooms now. And by saying we're rehumanizing it, it's a way of reconnecting to the holistic ways that our ancestors engaged in mathematics. And redoing that means that we're doing it nowadays in contemporary times, and trying to realize the many dimensions of rehumanizing mathematics that we can engage in nowadays.
Yeah. So I mean, so aside from like ethnomath, I think being an Indigenous person in a field of mathematics can really have can be tough. There's a lot of things that we as Indigenous people just face, and I don't know if any of the panel want to begin this discussion.
So one thing I wanted to just it sort of touches on what you just said, then I want to come back to what Belen was talking about, thinking about rehumanizing mathematics, because one of the things that I think is really important is, which also sort of relates to what our experiences are sort of in the community as Indigenous mathematicians, is also thinking sort of not just about the math we're doing, but about, I think I even mentioned this earlier, but sort of about the spaces we're building and the way that we inhabit them. And yeah, I love Rochelle Gutierrez's work. Like every time I read some of it or I hear her speak, because I think that it captures so much of the problems with how we build our math communities now, which is sort of as though the people in them are secondary to other things. And so one of the things I sort of wanted to touch on was that one of the ways that we can sort of bring our perspective and our heritages and our sort of ways of being in our community, like in sort of the communities that we grew up with, into our mathematical spaces, is to be really start thinking a little bit more critically about the sort of the ways that we participate in these systems. And so one of the things that I've been thinking especially of is because of listening to a talk of Belen, talking about even just the way we talk about bringing students of color into our fields. And this is something that's really, so I care about building community sort of in all forms. So I've been involved in a lot of work recently for building community in math spaces. So for example, I co-organize a program called Subgroups, where we sort of do these small group meetings of first-year graduate students to sort of help with the transition that can be really challenging from going from undergrad into grad school and is often super isolating, and sort of bringing people together from across institutions to have these sort of every 2-week meetings where they sort of get together and share their experience and hopefully bring support to each other. And another thing that I've been working on recently is this initiative called Paradigms, which is more focused at sort of the level of graduate program directors in math departments, and talking about sort of the way that they're recruiting students into the departments, and then the way that they're sort of nurturing their development when they're in the department. And one of the things that has really challenged me recently, I don't know if I've actually talked to Belen about this, but it's something that Belen has mentioned in a couple of his talks about the way that we recruit graduate students in mathematics, and sort of the way that we recruit students of color in mathematics is sort of through this very extractive colonial lens of sort of disconnecting them, uprooting them from their communities, and bringing them into our mathematical spaces as though we are giving them a gift, but we're just sort of plucking them as a natural resource and then giving nothing back, right? We're sort of disconnecting them. We're not thinking, it's not sort of in a relationship that is built through trust or sort of mutual respect or sort of a mutual giving. It's sort of purely extractive. And so it's been something that's really challenging to me, because as a brown woman in mathematics, like I want there to be more of me. I want there to be others like me to be in community with, to be doing my research with, to be teaching my classes with, so that I can feel like I belong. But how can I do that in a way that's sort of honoring the communities of these students that I sort of want to have here, that I want to bring? And so that's not something I have an answer for. I'm just like broaching this as something, this is a way I think that we can start thinking sort of about bringing sort of our own ways of knowing and being into our math spaces, and start thinking more critically about sort of how we do things that are just run of the mill, right? We don't even really think about it, because that's just sort of how the academy works. And that's sort of what we do. And so anyway, I don't have an answer. I love this, this perspective that Belen has mentioned, and it's been challenging me, and it's something that I'm still just thinking about and working through. And so I just wanted to bring it up because I think it sort of relates to this idea of what it means to be Indigenous in these spaces. And that maybe sometimes we have to start thinking a little bit beyond the mold of, right? Sort of that academia likes to put you, if you care about these issues, you get put into the diversity, inclusion, and equity mold, right? And I think sometimes we have to start thinking beyond that to see what we're really doing and how we're serving the communities that we want to be.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Marissa. But yeah, I mean, there really are a lot of it's a lot of struggles, a lot of things that we're facing, and it's gonna I'm gonna lead into the next thing that we're gonna talk about today, is that you know, a lot of us for a long time have felt like we're the only ones in the room, that we're the only ones in the department, the only ones at a workshop, the only ones in an entire conference, and to face these things alone is really taxing on us. To be the token person representing your whole people. But really, I mean, looking at the numbers, there should be more of us. There's like 1 to 5 people that get a doctorate in math every year that falls under the Native American category, and another 1 to 5 on Pacific Islanders. And so who are these people? And so what we've started and is we're starting a group for Indigenous people in mathematics. If you identify as an Indigenous person and you're in the field of mathematics, we want to welcome you to this group. And we started this website called Indigenous Mathematicians.org. And the website's slowly being built, okay? And be patient with me as I build more. But right now I have all the people that I'm aware of that have a doctorate in mathematicians on that website, except 2. I believe there's about 15 of them. The other 2, I'm still waiting to get their consent before I put them on the website. But I mean, I know there's more than 15. There has to be more out there. And since this website went live, you know, some people have told me of other names, and I'm starting to contact them. So thank you if you're already one of the people that have mentioned it. But this community is just a way to bring current Indigenous people in math together, to inspire other students that, you know, if you want to go into math, you can see that you're not alone, that there's all these other people out there. And just to educate other people, allies that want to know, you know, how can I support people that are Indigenous in math? You know, what are things that we can do, and just, you know, what are the struggles that are unique to Indigenous people that I hadn't considered. So this community that we're building is just a chance to bring together all of the people that care for Indigenous people in mathematics. And yeah, if you identify as someone, or you know someone that could benefit from this community, please contact us. Let us know. The email for that is on the website, but I believe it was
I did drop a link in the chat.
You dropped it. Okay. All right. Marissa dropped the link in the chat. But yeah, if you go under indigenousmathematicians.org, there we do have our email, and we just put an article on SACNES's blog about that as well, and I think Daryl will drop that link as well. But yeah, we're starting this community. We're all so excited to be together, and you know, everyone that I've talked to has said at some point in their career that's on the site, at some point in their career, they thought they're the only ones. They didn't know another one until 10 years into their career. And so just to be able to have us feel, you know, that we belong in STEM, that we belong in math, that, you know, it's okay, you know, to great if we know how to do ethnomathematics. It's okay if we don't. It's okay if, you know, if we are, you know, facing struggles, that there's other people out here for that. So that is yeah, Indigenous Mathematicians, and we would love to grow our community. But yeah, do the other panels want to add anything to this?
Just that my excitement was that this feels historic, and, and I've been able to present with 3 other Indigenous mathematicians, and thinking back to when I had to chase down, not had to, but when I chased down Bill Velez to seek out another brown person. And I'm excited for this project because if we have a website, then that lessens it gives more access for hopefully other aspiring mathematicians to reach out to the community. And I think part of and this is what I wanted to talk about with Marissa's work with paradigms and subgroups, where indigenizing mathematics also means it's tied with how mathematics is social and cultural. And if mathematics is social and cultural, and if being indigenous is political, then indigenizing mathematics also means disrupting the current social structures in mathematics and providing more access for Indigenous peoples. And so, you know, what Wayla and Marissa are doing with providing these communities and providing these kinds of social structures for our Indigenous communities, those are ways of indigenizing mathematics, because we're tackling their current social structures and making them more accessible for Indigenous and other peoples. So thank you for your works and your leaderships.
So we're about at the point in this webinar where we want to open it up for Q&A. And so if you have any questions, please ask it.
We have a question that popped up in the chat, and I'll just state what it says. What are some things we can do to help create a better environment in math departments?
How long do I have?
We have a good about 10-15 minutes for this session, so go for it.
Yeah, so this is, of course, this is something near and dear to my heart that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think there's, I think like the number one thing that we can do in our math departments to make them better environments is to honor and uplift the voices of our students of color. And that's a very simple thing to say, and that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And this is difficult sort of from all angles, whether it's because there's faculty who don't value these voices and really don't value the voices of students in general because they don't feel that they have the expertise or the experience to sort of speak to really understand what their needs are. There's sort of this infantilizing viewpoint of our students that they couldn't possibly articulate what they need of us. And then there's also the trouble from faculty who are very well-meaning and, who do want to have a better environment, but who are very invested sort of in being seen as allies and being seen as being good and being seen and sort of appreciated or valued by their students. And that makes it very hard for them to hear feedback that is saying, hey, yes, we understand that you are, wanting to do the right thing, but your actions, regardless of your intent, are harmful. And this is the way they're harming me. And these are the things that I think need to change. And that's really hard. And that is something that I have seen repeated over and over again, where there's situations where some very brave students of color come forward and sort of share explicitly, right? Not just sort of vague general things that like every department could do, but sort of specific things that their department could do to give them a better and more holistic experience that would meet their needs. And they're not listened to. And it's this mix of not caring about what they're saying and being unwilling to sort of very carefully reflect and interrogate on the ways in which what you're meaning to do is actually impacting the people that you're trying to serve. And so I think that there really needs to be a greater emphasis on sort of listening to the folks in your department more junior to you and recognizing that even when they're speaking sometimes with anger, because when people are hurt and when they have been made to suffer, when they are made to feel powerless, when they are not heard or served or listened to, there will be anger, right? That is a painful and terrible thing that I have experienced a lot in math spaces, that you need to be able to hear that anger and reflect on it instead of react to it. And then you need to say, what can I do? How can I change? And then sort of in that same vein, right, what is the way in which to have these conversations? It's taking the time to build trust with your students, to build trust with your colleagues, to actually be in community with people. I think there's often this time, I think it comes back again to this sort of very colonial mentality, or even like paternalistic, where we're thinking of ourselves as like serving people. And so we're sort of thinking of ourselves as having all the resources and we're being benevolent enough to share them. And if you're entering into sort of your department thinking in this way about the sort of most marginalized members, that is going to cause harm. Because you need to be entering into this with the idea that these are people that you should be in community with, so that you are serving them as you serve yourself, right? Like it shouldn't be this sort of weird, like, I have everything and let me see if I'm generous enough to share some of it with you. It should be about building relationships. It should be about building trust, so that when you're working to meet that need, it's a need that you see, that you can understand, instead of somehow just like feeling that maybe you need to share something that you have or something. And so I think that's sort of the other side of that, is that there needs to be more of a focus of truly being community with the people that you're trying to serve, instead of thinking that, like, as mathematicians often do, that you can somehow sort of abstractly identify a problem and fix it sort of in the ether without actually knowing and caring for and serving people.
All right, we've got folks jumping down in the chat, asking some questions. So I'll just, the Q&A feature, I don't know what happened, it disappeared on mine. So I'm just gonna jump on the chat and just go down as far as I can with some of the questions. So another question we have coming from Jade: do you bring relevant experiences to your classes that highlight research done by Indigenous communities or current work being done by Indigenous researchers? If so, are there any resources you know that you could recommend?
I'll field that one. So I think there are, right now I'm working on it. I'm trying to be better at like highlighting more of the work of just underrepresented people in math. For example, I have a history of math class where I every day I highlight a different woman in math, as well as you know, I'm trying to highlight a person of color. But our website, indigenousmathematicians.org, has all the mathematicians out there. We don't have anything about their research, which is a great thing. I wrote a note when I saw your question to add to that website, so we can start having stuff like that. But if you know who the people are, then you can start searching either their website or Google Scholar to see the different works if you want to highlight specific works from people. But I think that is something that I do want to add to our website, maybe to have a little feature on people and stories about who they are, as well as their research for that. So you know, check back in a month or so, and hopefully we'll have something on that. And I know people have also asked about just resources for adding like ethnomath into their courses and cultural ways. I do want to reemphasize the College of Education at University of Hawaii Ethnomathematics. I think the link was dropped earlier. Dr. Linda Fruto has really developed quite a program over there, and there are a lot of resources on their website. So if you're interested more specifically in, you know, Native Hawaiian cultural relevance, but you might be able to find ties on other things, and I believe there's other resources out there for different cultural related things in mathematics.
All right, moving on to the next question. You've talked about this in the context of higher education mostly, and how can we foster Indigenous identity and STEM identity in younger students? Dr. Sinogini spoke to not feeling proficient in the Navajo language and culture as a young person, which makes me think about the question I'm asking. So how can we foster Indigenous identity and STEM identity in younger students?
I keep drawing on Rochelle Gutierrez's Rehumanizing Mathematics as a framework, but some of her dimensions include tackling rehumanizing in multiple aspects and in multiple dimensions. And one of those dimensions includes the mirrors and windows dimensions, where you know, you're introducing perspectives from one's own background and communities, and also providing opportunities to see mathematics through the lens and windows of others. But there are other ways of tackling identity and supporting students' identities through those multiple dimensions. So I think the idea is that it's hard to tackle that all at once, but navigating those multiple dimensions a little bit at a time, whether it's through representation and like this Indigenous Mathematician website could like highlight representation, and there's a lot of focus on seeing representation out there with professional mathematicians, but also extending out into our communities and looking into the works out there that focus on communities as assets. And I also draw upon the works of Funds of Knowledge that highlight the wealth of knowledge that come from our communities, and seeing communities as collaborators and people that we serve. So tying into it, Marissa was saying that we want to break down those barriers that we're serving. We're in service of people who come to the schools, but we also need to break down those barriers and that often exist between schools and the communities. So those are kind of like guiding principles, and there's work out there, and what my dissertation highlighted was like how that that barrier still exists, and that there's a wealth of knowledge, and that there's students who bring that knowledge even nowadays, but there's still that ongoing assimilationist project that discounts that knowledge that comes into the classroom. So it's partly constantly asking that question: what kinds of knowledge and rich histories do our students and their families and their communities bring to our education spaces?
Okay, I probably just want to let our audience know that we are at 1 hour, and I will field a couple more questions for the panelists because this has been so engaging for everyone, and then we'll wrap up. But just wanted to make that note to everyone. So I'm going to move on. Oh, the other thing I wanted to note too is that I will be copying the chat, and I will be sharing that with our panelists because there are more questions, more really good questions on here, and we'll look to see how we can get a response for most of them. So we'll be in touch with that in the email that goes out sharing this webinar. So a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up here. So what do you see are the relationships that need to be created between mathematicians and mathematics educators as we move forward?
I think I was part of a research group that collaborated with mathematicians, math educators, and teacher educators, the Kamilla group, and that was valuable in seeing and understanding the different strengths that those fields often represent and bring. And I think one thing that I'm hoping for mathematicians to do, and I'm seeing a bit more now than I did 10 years ago, is how mathematicians can recognize how math educators and education researchers and cultural scholars and critical scholars have been doing a lot of this work that we're talking about in the need for mathematicians and math departments to be more community oriented. And when math departments commit to diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism, then acknowledge that they're very limited in their experience and research, and there are many people often in many departments and often in their own institutions that they can learn from and build off of. And the challenge and the potential for, by not, the downside of not doing so would be projects that feel like white saviorism, where math departments feel like they're doing a service to these communities and they're saving communities without doing the work that other departments, and even not only departments within the institution, but community-oriented organizations outside of academic institutions are are there to exist and have been doing their work on the ground too. So I think, you know, I started delving out of the math and math education research relationship, but that it's important to realize and understand that, and this is something I experienced too when I transitioned from mathematics to math education, that there is also power dynamics within those scholarships and those different worlds, and that's something to acknowledge and to. I don't have answers, but I have experiences, and I know others have experiences with that too.
Oh, sorry. Can I jump in real quick? So just one thing that all of us can do, all of us who are sort of mathematicians or scientists in our respective fields, is work to make sure, I think, especially mathematicians, that we're uplifting the work of the fantastic math educators out there. I think this is something that mathematicians are just so loath to acknowledge that someone else might have expertise they don't. Somehow I've noticed this. And so I think there's often a reticence to listen to the expertise that is being shared about the way that we structure our classrooms, the way that we structure our departments. And I think we can sort of very actively combat this. So in grad school, I, along with some of my awesome friends, Simone Cisneros Theory and Vanessa Vivera Quinones, started a teaching and diversity seminar. And one of the things that we did was we brought in both mathematicians and math education researchers, all women of color, to come and talk about either their research or their experiences in mathematics. And I think, like, bring them into the conversation, right? We're in math departments. These are spaces we inhabit. We have a choice about whose voices we're incorporating into sort of into our departments, into our conversations, into our seminars. And I think that this is something that we need to be active about. We need to really be thinking critically about how we can do this. And we can also do this sort of on our own. So I've also been doing here at Georgia Tech, where I'm a postdoc, a reading and learning seminar with some of the other, a couple faculty, a couple postdocs, and a few graduate students, where we're reading about various math education work. So we've read some of Michelle's work. This semester we read Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress. Go and educate yourself, right? There's a wealth of knowledge and things out there, and we should be engaging. I'm super excited that hopefully, depending on what happens with the pandemic, this coming summer, I'm supposed to be going to a workshop run by Rochelle at Park City Math on rehumanizing math. And I think of myself as a geometric group theorist, but as a mathematician, one of my big roles is as an educator. And so I think developing that aspect of us and developing the ways that we think sort of critically about both our like pedagogy in the classroom and also sort of more generally how we construct our communities is really vital to having a healthier math community.
This is great. All right, we're gonna probably just have one more question and then we'll probably just wrap up. So, but this has been wonderful. Well, I'm learning a lot. So thank you for this. So here's the last question. Do you think there is a problem when using the terms mathematics, indigenous mathematics, ethnomathematics?
Personally, I don't think there's a problem using those different terms. It does help to describe some of the things that we're doing and who we are. You know, in indigenous math just is one way of saying, you know, this is the math that our ancestors use. You know, it's ancestral knowledge is being used. I think ethnomath again is very similar, and so it just helps to put a name to some of the mathematics that's out there. It helps to put identity and place-based knowledge on what it is. So I personally don't think there's a problem with that.
All right. Well, we are at the end of this wonderful webinar. And again, I want to thank Marissa, Belen, and Wela for taking time out of their schedule to present. I was just kind of skimming through the comments in the chat, and folks are wanting a parts 2 and 3. So maybe looking ahead, maybe that's possible. So we will definitely take that into consideration. I want to thank everyone for joining, and just have a couple of slides to share as we wrap up our time here. So please stay tuned for more webinars from SACNAS. You can always find our upcoming webinars and previous webinars at sacnas.org/webinars. And then also, just want to remind folks that SACNAS recently participated in the Giving Tuesday Day of Giving. And if you missed it, there is still time to participate. You can visit sacnas.org/give to learn more about how your generous donation can impact many through SACNAS. So thank you again for taking time to be with us this afternoon. And please tune in, visit all our websites, and we hope you have a good rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.